Hello, my name is Kimberly Ferguson. I am with the Library of Congress in the Congressional Research Service, and it's myself and 7 other people on my team who are responsible for the daily operational and development support for Congress.gov. We work with many other people here at the Library of Congress, as well as lots of people in the legislative branch, and I'll go into that in a bit. The Library of Congress is it's the National Library of the United States, and excuse me, it's the National Library of the United States, and Congress asked the Library of Congress to help them by producing what is now known as Congress.gov, and I'll go into that history in a little bit as well. But the point I want to make right now is that Congress.gov is really a 3rd generation online digital system. Started in the 1970s at the request of the House and Senate. The library hosted a mainframe system where we shared legislative data back and forth. And then around 1999, as we were preparing for Y2K and the transition to the year 2000, we had our very first web-based version of Congress.gov. It was actually 2 different systems at the time. One was for inside the legislative branch, the other was for the public to use. And then about 12 years ago, the Library of Congress released Congress.gov. Another important point about Congress.gov that I want to make is that the website Congress.gov really is a data aggregator. So we don't necessarily produce content, but we aggregate content from, these days it's approximately 30 different data sources are aggregated by Congress.gov. And so my point is, from our perspective, Congress.gov is a modern system, but most of the data sources that we are downstream from are the systems that we are spending a lot of our time and energy and resources to modernize. One other thing I want to make a point about is, for more than 50 years, we have been saying that our data is timely, accurate, and complete. We have been telling the truth, but over the decades, we have kind of changed what is the definition of timely, accurate, and complete. So I'll go into that as well. The last point that I want to make before we move on is that Congress.gov uses the Agile development system. We have a 3-week development cycle. That's really an important point because we have many decades of development and previous systems, as I mentioned, and our new approach really is, I think, an important component of when we're talking about modernization in this effort. So I really want to reiterate, there are multiple organizations that are involved in Congress.gov, and the most prominent organizations are the United States House, the United States Senate, our colleagues at the Government Publishing Office, and there are quite a few people here at the Library of Congress that are involved as well. And modernization efforts it's not like we have one effort. We have lots of different efforts that are going in different directions, and kind of going with that agile approach that I mentioned. We really, we're all over the board, all over the map. We're working on metadata, we're working on full text documents, and there is an expectation that congressional materials are online dating from 1789. And so we have really, wherever there's an opportunity to move forward on one of these multiple projects, we try to move forward. So we have lots of balls in the air. And I just want to touch quickly on some of the modern aspects that we talk about very frequently, and one has to do with the structure of the data. The United States Congress is in the process of moving toward publishing all of our documents in USLM, that represents the United States legislative markup. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but just in brief, it's an agreed upon data standard that the House and the Senate, all of the data providers, as well as GPL and the Library of Congress, are working on, so that we have a shared common standard for producing our documents. MODS is another data standard that's really, really critical to modernizing, because interoperability, we have multiple organizations and we need to have interoperability. And so MODS is another really important component. More data standards, and UTF-8 really is an international data standard, and it has to do with character encoding. And Congress.gov uses UTF-8, and we're working with our data partners to make sure that all of the systems can support that. Very similarly, ISO 8601 is a date and timestamp standard. And as I mentioned, we are working with some systems that really date back to the 1970s and predate these date and timestamp data standards, which is important for us to retroactively go back to these legacy systems. And as we replace legacy systems, we need to make sure that they can support UTF-8 and ISO 8601, as well as many other really important data standards. And then unique identifiers for members of Congress, as well as all of the data types that we feature in Congress.gov, for example, committee meetings and committees and subcommittee authority records. And then also the congressional record is one example of a full text document that we ingest into Congress.gov, and making adjustments to the way that data structure is available is another important piece of what we're working on. And so I'll start with the 1970s, and I will start with metadata. And I want to just share this document. This bill status system for the United States House of Representatives is really could be considered the birth certificate for the current online, really for Congress.gov. We've digitized this document, and anyone who has interest, I enthusiastically encourage you to take a look at the introduction. So this was written by staffers in the United States House in the 1970s when they were trying to solve the problem of how to present timely, accurate, and complete information about the bill status system. I also want to call your attention to this chart that is a large poster fold-out of the document we just looked at a minute ago. And it really was literally laying the foundation or the groundwork for all of the possible actions that a bill could take in the process as it moves through the legislative process. So these two documents are really interesting to look at our baseline, or our foundation of what we are working on. And the reason those documents were assembled is because the appropriators in the United States House and in the United States Senate have a responsibility every spring to agree upon legislation to fund different parts of the United States government. And as they were looking at the requests that were coming in from legislative branch agencies, the the Appropriations Committee staffers recognized that lots of different legislative branch agencies were asking for funds to design legislative tracking systems. And they thought there maybe would be a better way than giving funds to each individual agency. Maybe there was some other way to deal with these legislative tracking systems. And so they asked the Library of Congress to analyze what are the possible ways to reduce the duplication of effort across the legislative branch agencies. And then ultimately that resulted in the very first mainframe system, creation of the very first mainframe system in the 1970s period of time. And so eventually, that all led to the Congress.gov system that we're familiar with today. So, there's a lot of text on this slide. I apologize for that. But behind the scenes technology work, there's not a lot of interesting things to look at, really. But that legacy data exchange that I mentioned a moment ago, we just modernized that data exchange for the very first time less than a year ago. And it took multiple years and multiple organizations, but we replaced the original data sources that we set up quite a few years ago, and we replaced those data sources with more technologically sophisticated data sources. And while in the 1970s, it really was just a single flow of information from the House to the Library of Congress, as well as from the Senate to the Library of Congress. By the time we modernized that data exchange, we were receiving data from the House and the Senate. In addition to legislative data, we were receiving data for amendments and executive communications, as well as nomination and treaty data from the United States Senate, as well as authority records for members and committees. So this is a picture of what the data flow among our agencies looks like today. I mentioned, initially it was just the House was sending one file of data to the library, and the Senate was sending one file of data to the library, and then the library would kind of stitch together the legislative information from the House and the Senate. But you can see from this chart, there are lines going bidirectionally, so both to the library as well as from the library. Also, there are lines of data going to the Government Publishing Office and from the Government Publishing Office, and certainly using the APIs that are now available from Congress.gov as well as from GPL. Our House and Senate data partners are now just becoming, they're building some APIs as well that will certainly help to improve our data exchange as well. But you can see in these boxes, we now are exchanging lots more data than just legislative. We're bringing in materials from committees and hearings and reports, as well as amendments and laws. So now we can hop a couple decades into the future where we start to talk about full text documents. And the House and Senate involved in putting full text documents really started to understand more about the requirements of interoperability and more of an understanding about the requirements that data standards just have to be present. There's another thing that the House and Senate we're starting to realize that you can probably recognize pretty easily with this visual. So when the House and Senate started to put materials online in the middle 1990s, the materials looked a lot like what we're looking at right now. And so this is plain old ASCII text. And you'll notice that it it only fills really less than 50% of the screen. And so the thinking at the time was that the online representation of these materials should replicate the PDFs, the public presentation, or the official printed documents of these materials. And so when you look at the ASCII text, you can see intentional effort went into this presentation so that it would be really similar to what the PDFs look like, as far as the line breaks and this representation online. Since that time, though, and you heard me mention the term USLM, a lot of effort has gone into presenting full text materials online in a more web-friendly and user-friendly way, and to not force those hard returns, for example, into the online presentation. And another really important aspect of this is is the responsive nature of the website. And so if someone is looking at this material from an iPhone, for example, the page changes so that it isn't it's a responsive presentation, and it's just more web friendly. So the recognition and the realization that data standards are important for interoperability really led Congress to put it into law, and gave the library, gave the House and Senate enacted legislation to say the Library of Congress is responsible for hosting the legislative information retrieval system. And not too long after that, House and Senate said, and also the Library of Congress is responsible for that exchange of information among our legislative branch agencies. And it really is saying the Library of Congress needs to be involved in helping the agencies understand how important data standards are, so that we can support our interoperability requirements. And so about the middle 1990s, Congress passes laws, and there's recognition and a lot of effort moving toward USLM for bill texts, and definitely starting to think about additional documents as well. But once we got things figured out for how are we going to represent print, things started moving beyond the print world. And so from the representing print on the computer screens is one thing that we started to do, but then, Congress is being reflective of, people in the United States, and they want to see things in video as well. And then there's also been in recent decades a demand for the underlying metadata. And so we're not dealing with print only, we're dealing with video as well as the API, where metadata is a good source for machines to get at the underlying data. So I mentioned USLM, and it is a data standard that has been in development by members of the House, the Government Publishing Office, and the Library of Congress. Whoops, I'm sorry. And, here we go. We've got the Legislative Branch XML Working Group that is moving toward establishing this standard, and it's taking quite a few decades to get to this point. The USLM schema is actually a second generation XML data structure, and data partners are working together, moving toward establishing this data standard. But because Congress continues to do their work, GPO and the House and the Senate and the Library of Congress, we are also continuing to do our work. We're developing while we're also relying on these new systems that we're developing, which is a little bit of a way to explain why it is taking so very long to make this transition, because we're doing all of our regular, normal progress, but we're also designing for the future and to bring our production of congressional documents into more modern times. Video, again, is something that we are in the process of transitioning from generation 1 video for really 4 different data sets: the House chamber, the Senate chamber, what happens in House committees, and what happens in Senate committees. And so what we're doing in our kind of second generation on these 3 efforts is trying to come up with data standards that can be used for all 4 of these different data sets. And a lot of this has to do with, in addition to interoperability, it has to do with archiving copies of these materials and being efficient with having standards that can be applied to all of these data sets that can be reused and repurposed to allow interoperability across all of these data sets. And then finally, the Congress.gov API is a relatively new product. People have wanted to have access to the underlying Congress.gov data for a number of years, and it has been available maybe for just 2 or 3 years now. The Congress.gov API provides access to all of the underlying data that is available from Congress.gov, and there's quite a lot of documentation. And as I mentioned, as the House and the Senate are really modernizing their systems that deliver data to the Library of Congress, we are working with them to take advantage of the Congress.gov API. And so there are quite a few different projects in quite a few different directions, and we're moving forward on all of those as we can. And then finally, this last piece of what our modernization efforts are has to do with historical documents. There was a project that was done here at the Library of Congress maybe about 30 years ago, where we digitized the first 100 years of historical documents that we were able to access. But 30 years ago, digitizing standards were different from what they are now. And so the PDFs were not machine readable, for example. Also, digital projects that were done 30 years ago are on servers that are need to be retired right about now. And so we've been working on a project to bring all of those historical materials into Congress.gov. And those are requiring that we retroactively apply data standards, and just a very understandable reason why we wouldn't have to do that is in the earliest years in Congress, there wasn't even necessarily an agreement on how to number bills. And so really, at least the first 20, 25 years, there's not standardization in how bills are numbered, and it doesn't just change in counting 1, 2, 3, but here, as you see, is an example where a bill has a half number, and this is not completely uncommon. So as we're going through these historic materials, we're finding decisions, publishing decisions that definitely predate data standards, and they're giving us lots of opportunity to solve problems. So I just want to trace all of this back to the U.S. Constitution that mandates certain documents need to be produced by the House and Senate as they work through the legislative process. And there is also a requirement of data transparency. And so it's the House and Senate journals that are required by the United States Constitution. We have quite a number of documents that are required by Senate rules, primarily calendars, the executive calendar and the calendar of business. The House rules also require certain documents. The House, as it was set up by the Constitution, members of the House are reelected every 2 years, while members of the Senate are only reelected every 6 years. That's intentional, but it reflects itself in an unintentional way, really, as we're thinking about modernizing systems and workflows, because the House really has an opportunity. They rewrite their rules every 2 years, and so the House is a little bit faster as far as adopting new technologies. And two of the things that you see on this screen, the House Committee Repository, as well as bills to be considered, these are actually online systems and relatively new data sources for Congress.gov. And so we work in lockstep with the chambers as they modernize their systems. We have to certainly reflect those updates. And House and Senate committees as well produce quite a few materials and documents, and we represent all of those in Congress.gov as well. Just more materials that we make available online. I want to show you the coverage dates listing on Congress.gov, and you'll notice the variety of different start dates that we have for these materials, and they really do reflect different start years and different efforts to bring more data into the system. And so you'll see some start years as early as 1799, and some other start years, for example, for Senate amendment text, are relatively recent. And the one last thing, and honestly, as a librarian, I think is maybe one of the more important aspects of modernizing material, is support documentation. And so on Congress.gov, I'll just show you a real quick example. We have a searchable help center, and I think having online supported help is one of the more important aspects of modern data, is to give the end user information to help them understand what is the data that we're looking at and how do we use that data. So I mentioned at the beginning, accurate, timely, and complete. We used this phrase a lot in the 1970s when we were talking about making metadata available to the House and Senate, really dating from 1973. But these days, when we talk about accurate, timely, and complete, we're, I think, moving towards satisfying what people expect, and that is that congressional materials dating from 1789 to the present are within Congress.gov. We certainly have not achieved that yet, but that is the goal that we are moving toward, is to bring all of these materials online and to integrate them and to create relationships across the documents through the web interface. And so that's what I have, and I'd be happy to talk through questions with you.
Thank you, Kimberly. I have a few questions.
Yeah.
The first thing was, you described the Library of Congress as the aggregator of information. You're pulling together information from the U.S. House, the Senate, GPO. How do you define the boundaries? What is your role versus the role of the various agencies? They all have their own websites. They publish information too. How do you decide what is it sometimes duplicated? Do they sometimes use your data in their websites? How do you decide on the differences?
That's a good question. Well, I think we have to talk about why does the Congressional Research Service exist in order to move toward answering that question. And we have to talk about the fact that congressional documents are not always immediately understandable on their face. And so the Congressional Research Service has been assigned or mandated really by the House and Senate to facilitate finding aids for legislative materials dating back to really the early 1900s. And the thing that pops into my mind are bill summaries. So I know since at least 1935, the Congressional Research Service has been responsible for authoring bill summaries for bill texts. And so there's not overlap in that, but I consider a bill summary really to be a finding aid for a bill text, because most normal people are not trained in how do you read a bill text and how do you understand a bill text. In fact, I'm assuming that the House and Senate mandated the Library of Congress to write summaries for bill texts because sometimes even members of Congress could benefit from having a summary that is written. And those bill summaries really pull together law from all three branches of government, not only legislative law, but they pull in federal regulations and they pull in judicial law. And so it's an enhancement or a finding aid that makes the work of Congress, the primary source materials, more usable and user-friendly. And I think it really is important that we're making it more usable and user-friendly to members of the House and Senate, to the people who are actually working through the legislative process. And so there's definitely not overlap in that, but there's a dependency. The House and Senate have dependency, for example, on the bill summaries, and the bill summaries definitely have a dependency on the House and Senate sending the text of a bill to GPO to be published. And so it's, I think, working through really good partnerships on, we all know what we need to do, probably based on hundreds of years of working together. And we don't necessarily have extra resources to duplicate efforts, and so we're really stealth about making sure that, you know, somebody's covering whatever it is that needs to be done. Did that partly at least answer your question?
Yes, and it leads nicely into my next question. Part of your role is to publish the information and annotate it a little bit beyond that. Do you have a mandate to provide services on top of that information, like comparison services, for instance, other tools that help make the information more useful?
Definitely, yes. And so policy area terms and legislative subject terms is definitely a very good example of how we make the information on congress.gov more useful. Related bills is another one where it's really helpful and useful to users to see those relationships and you know, building relationships from a legislative history relationship. So pulling together a legislative history where a committee report supports a piece of legislation and tracking things. So yeah, a lot of those finding aid types of materials. And just today is the day where CRS reports have been brought into congress.gov as a new collection, and that is definitely another area where the Congressional Research Service work that helps really to make the primary source documents produced by Congress a little bit more understandable, both to the people who create the materials and write the legislation, as well as others who have dependencies on that.
Does that include, do you also publish the US code, or is that just?
The U.S. Code is produced by the Office of Law Revision Counsel, and they have a team of attorneys and editors. And so no, the library does not do that. It's the Office of Law Revision Counsel, and they're under the jurisdiction of the House.
That's a question that just has to be asked, but do you see AI having any role in influencing the tools you provide in the future? Any worries or concerns about that?
We use machines to make our work, you know, to try to make our work be more efficient. But I don't believe we're ready to turn that work over to AI quite yet. We've done lots of piloting and lots of experimenting on how to make things be, you know, to get a feel for where we can and can't have dependencies on these things. And at this point, we're nowhere near turning things over without having humans review and check and double check. I would say that the error rate is more at the 75% range right now. And we need the error rate to be closer to less than 1 or 2%. And so we have a long way to go. There's definitely so much room for using machines to do more intelligent things. But we need data structures and data standards to be thoroughly integrated. USLM, for example, is a really important, and there are too many things to list, but lots and lots and lots of work to do, I think, before we can depend more upon the machines to do things. We have lots of manual curation that's necessary right now, largely because data standards are not completely used by all of the systems that deliver data to us.
You talked about the API that you provide now. Does that include access to the live access to the USLM data, or does it require, do you still have to do a download of that data?
API, the Congress.gov API is not really doing much, if anything, with USLM at this point. That's really more GPO. We provide access from the API to the full text of documents, but I believe it's just HTML and PDFs at this point. The USLM effort, as you know, it's still officially in beta, and so yeah.
I have a question, if I can, to take up on the USLM topic. So we know that USLM is a close sister to Legal DocML, but I'm wondering if you could give your perspective on the value of these legal document standards, both from an operational perspective and from the benefits that they might provide, or value they might provide to citizens as well.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I'm a librarian. I believe in data standards. They help to make our work be so much more efficient. So what end users can benefit from is more reliable relationships across documents, more reliable updates. For example, GPO or the House or Senate updates something, the Library of Congress can update our version of that rendition more quickly. Citations and search, gosh, almost every single aspect of making these materials transparent and available to people has some type of positive benefit from USLM and the legal ML. I'm a little less involved in those, but yeah, data standards are so important, whether you're indexing something for a traditional back of the book or indexing something for presentation on a web browse page or indexing something for search. You have data standards. It's just going to be cleaner, more efficient, more timely, more accurate, more up to date, more complete. The benefits are huge. The drawback is people who aren't information professionals. You know, it costs a lot of resources to do those things, and so that really is where the challenge is that it's hard for people to understand that things are not born in beautiful structured form. But yes, definitely proponent and looking forward to more documents in USLM and more systems that support the data standards that are really critical. Moving toward AI in particular, we have to have those things in place.
So I have a follow-up. So you mentioned it does take time. This is a real effort.
Yes.
If you were what you've gone through from your experience, there are maybe other governments with not as much resources, subnational state governments here in the U.S. Any advice for them if they're looking to move into more of a data structured approach? From an operational perspective, are there things you might do first or things not to pay attention to? Any advice for people who are looking to start this process?
That's a great question. And I think having individuals who understand the structure of the documents and understand the content of the documents, so having those types of subject matter experts involved from the beginning is really, really important, because I imagine each state or each nation has a slightly different structure of what their documents are and how their documents interact with one another. That's not cookie cutter. Every government is not set up in the exact same way. And so you cannot expect that if you hire someone from the outside, they're necessarily going to understand how special your materials are. You have to have people who understand the traditional legacy way of producing those materials involved, because a lot of thought went into creating the legacy workflows, and I just think it's really, really important to have the content producers and the data owners involved from the very beginning. Just because you can't walk in from outside without that knowledge or understanding. There's no way we would be as far as we are if we didn't have such valuable relationships with our House and Senate and GPO partners. It really is important to understand the challenges. So that's probably the most important thing, is have people who understand the process.